Okay, everybody, I hope you're having a good week, and B'ezras Hashem, as we enter the period of the 3 weeks, we hope that they should become times of joy and redemption, just as the Navi said. All of these fast days will be days of simcha, when the Mikdash is rebuilt and Mashiach comes. So this week's parsha, of course, is the story of Pinchas, and the story of Pinchas is a direct continuation of Balak. Balak, the king of Moab, hired this fellow Bilam to curse the Jewish people, and Bilam's curses were ineffective. They turned into blessings. So Bilam developed a plan B, that if he can't curse the Jewish people, he will seek to destroy them by causing them to sin. Now the Arizal draws a very, very intriguing connection between plan A and plan B. He says the following: the Gemara in Brachos tells us that we talked about this last week, that the secret of Bilam's success at cursing is there is a fraction of a second every day in which divine wrath fills the world, and if you utter your curse in that little window of divine wrath, the curse will be effective. You push the right button, but that button disappears very quickly. Bilam's great skill was he knew exactly when the button was available. Well, how did God circumvent that? It seems to be a law of divine nature that's the way it works. So the Arizal says God canceled the anger that day. The button was not there. In fact, he even has an amazing interpretation when the pasuk says, "Vayichar af Elokim," God was angry, ki holechu, because he is going. Bilam is going with Balak. The Arizal interprets it this way: it doesn't say Vayichar Elokim. It says Vayichar af Elokim. So if you translate it literally, it means the anger of God was angry, ki holech, because the anger had to go away, meaning God moved the anger from its customary status in the world. So the anger was angry, ki holechu, because it had to leave. That's how the Arizal interprets it. Now, what is the function, what is the purpose of this moment, this split second of divine wrath? God is not destroying the world generally. Why is it here? So the Svarim say that is the shirish of the inhibitions that people have not to cross certain lines. In other words, people have sometimes the fear of God. Even if the Yetzer Hara is very strong, most people are going to be inhibited. And the source of that inhibition is the residual feeling the neshama has of that moment of ema, pachad, and yira, and that suffuses us with a sense of midat hadin, the attribute of justice, the attribute of punishment, the attribute of retribution, of accountability. So here is the brilliance of Bilam. Bilam was truly brilliant in a diabolical way. If Bilam sees that his curses are ineffective, he intuits that this is not a day of divine wrath. But if it's not a day of divine wrath, the normal inhibitors on immoral behavior are not operative. Consequently, the Jewish people are more vulnerable to the type of sin that they normally would not engage in. So Bilam immediately says, let's formulate a plan B. I can't curse them because it's not a time of wrath. But if it's not a time of wrath, they don't have the inhibition on their immoral Yetzer Hara. So now I will try to entice them with sin, with the daughters of Moab, and with the idolatry of Baal Peor. So plan B basically says, if I can't curse them, I will cause them to fail by committing the sins of idolatry and sexual immorality. And plan B, unfortunately, was a lot more successful from Bilam's perspective than plan A. Thousands and thousands of Jews were dying. They were dropping. 24,000 people died. And then we have the story of the Nasi of Shimon, very prominent person, who is publicly fornicating with a Midianite woman. And he goes over to Moshe brazenly and says, permitted or not permitted? And Moshe says, forbidden. So he responds, and who allowed you to be with Yisro's daughter, who is also a Midianite woman? Now, of course, that's kind of a ridiculous comparison. We assume that Tzipora converted, but Moshe was frankly flabbergasted.
Excuse me, why was it ridiculous comparison?
Well, our assumption is that Moshe did not violate a Torah law. That's our assumption. I mean, you want to say he did. I mean, but our assumption is that there was a gior, etc. Even the Lashon Hara that Miriam had spoken about Moshe was merely that he was celibate. She was not attacking the fact that he was married to a non-Jewish woman. That was never a point of criticism. So we then have Pinchas, who takes the law in his own hands. Pinchas is a vigilante, and Pinchas kills both the man Zimri and the woman, the Midianite woman Cosby. And in this act of violence, he brings a redemption on the Jewish people, that the Magefah, the plague that had already killed 24,000 people, immediately stopped. And in consequence, Pinchas is given a great blessing. Now, the particular, just to be sure everyone's on the same page, again, you may know this, so forgive me for saying what you already know. What Pinchas did falls within the following unusual halachic framework. Generally speaking, when people commit any offense, they have to be tried by a court or Beit Din, and there have to be witnesses, and there have to be warnings, and there's no such concept, unless in the case of preventing murder, there's no such concept of simply taking the law into my own hands and killing. But this is what is called a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It was a particular law that was given in the part of the oral law, that if a Jewish man is publicly, and I underline publicly, not in a hotel room, but publicly in front of people, fornicating with a non-Jewish woman, a kanoi, a zealous person, now we'll have to define that term, is permitted to kill both the man and the woman, but only when they are actively engaged in the sexual union. Once they had stopped, at that point, a kanoi can no longer act. It's a little bit similar to an old law that existed in Texas many years ago. I think it's been repealed, in which if a man caught his wife with another person, in flagrante delicto was the technical term, in the middle of intercourse, he was actually permitted to kill them both and would not be prosecuted for murder. But once the man and the woman separated, he would not be permitted to act. Well, this is the halacha of kanoi pogenbo. A kanoi can do this. Now, let me point out how very narrow and specific this is. Number one, it only applies to a Jewish man and a non-Jewish woman. It does not apply to a non-Jewish man and a Jewish woman, although that is prohibited, but the heter of the kanoi does not apply. So it has to be Jewish man with non-Jewish woman, number one. It has to be public, which is comparatively rare, number two. Number three, it has to be while the act is going on. And number four, which is the least defined requirement, the person must be a legitimate kanoi. Now we'll talk about what that means exactly, meaning this is not a law for everybody. This is a law only for the person who could be characterized as a kanoi. And I will elaborate on what exactly that might mean. Obviously, that's the least defined of all of these conditions. What is fascinating is that this was an act of violence, even if it was justified. Let's assume it was halachically justified within the parameters of the halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Nevertheless, Pinchas is given not only a blessing, but he is given a blessing of peace. Whatever that means exactly, but apparently he was given the capacity to bring peace between people, as Aaron did, Ohev Shalom, a lover of peace, a pursuer of peace, and he's able to bring peace between God and the Jewish people. Again, it's an important paradox to note that it's not simply that Pinchas was blessed and his actions were approved, but he was blessed with the specific blessing that seems to be the antithesis and the opposite of the action that he did. And that itself is going to be notable. We'll come back to that. So let's, did you want to say something? Yeah.
Yes, don't we understand that the act of sexual union occurred in privacy, inside the tent, and therefore the parameter of public transgression?
Yes, that is a good question. It does say that Pinchas went into the tent and stuck them. So does that not contradict the requirement that it be a public act? So apparently, you're correct. Apparently we would have to redefine the notion of a public act as that when he takes this woman and says, I'm going into the tent to be with her, even if the actual penetration, so to speak, is not in the eyesight of people, that would be considered to be a public act. The announcement and then the going in to carry out that announcement. So let's start off with the yichus question, the lineage question. When God gives Pinchas the blessing of peace, Pinchas is described as Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron. He took my wrath away from Bnei Israel, and I did not destroy Bnei Israel. Therefore he shall be given a covenant of peace. So Rashi already raises the question, Chazal raised it earlier, that why is his descent given all the way to his grandfather? Normally we just say Pinchas, the son of Elazar. What is the purpose of saying Pinchas, the son of Elazar, the son of Aaron? So Rashi brings the following medrash, that when Pinchas killed the head of the tribe of Shimon, a very chashuv person, the Shvatim were mavazen also. The Shvatim insulted him. And the Shvatim said, who does this guy think he is? His own grandfather, meaning just like Moshe married a daughter of Yisro, Elazar married a daughter of Yisro, and Pinchas was the son of a Midianite woman himself. So his mother's father had himself been an idolater and a pagan. Who does he think he is that he is executing judgment against people who are not living up to the proper standards? His own lineage is tainted. So the Torah says, okay, let's not look at Pinchas on his mother's side. Let's look at Pinchas on his father's side, and he comes from Aaron. That's what Rashi says. Now, that statement seems to be a non sequitur, because every human being that we know of, generally, unless you're a clone or something, comes from a father and a mother. And if they have some type of argument, although it's hard to know what their argument is, that Pinchas is tainted because on his mother's side he comes from Yisro, you're not really getting rid of that taint by saying, okay, let's not look at his mother, let's look at his father. They'll say, no, I want to look at his mother. Right? So exactly, what are they saying, number one? And number two, if they do have some claim that because the father of his mother was Yisro and there is a problem, then you're not getting rid of that problem by saying, let's not look at that side of it, let's look at that side of it. So the whole medrash is a difficult medrash. Also, I want to bring in, as Rabbi Poston mentioned right before the shir, that although Rashi only mentions the Yisro connection, right? Rashi mentions that Pinchas's grandfather was Yisro, the mother of his father. There's Elazar married a daughter of Yisro, so Yisro was Pinchas's grandfather. In fact, there is another Gemara that mentions that Pinchas is also a descendant of Yosef. And the question is exactly, how can you be all of those things at once? Pinchas's father was Aaron, who was a Kohen of Shevet Levi. Pinchas' grandfather, yes. Pinchas's mother, we say, was a daughter of Yisro. So how do you get Yosef into his family line at all? So the short answer is, the Gemara actually explains that you have to tweak this a little bit, that Elazar did not actually marry, Elazar did not actually marry a daughter of Yisro. Elazar married a descendant of Yisro. It could have been a grandchild, a great-grandchild, etc. And in that line of descent, there were people of Yosef that had intermarried in those intervening. You are correct. If you understand Rashi very, very literally, that Pinchas's mother was a direct daughter of Yisro, you're going to have your problem. But if you understand it was one who was descended from Yisro, then there could have been marriages from Shevet Yosef there. But be it as it may, I want to share with you an interesting thought of the Kesef Sofer. The Kesef Sofer was the son of the Chassam Sofer. And I think in many ways this comment was an autobiographical reflection of his own father. And he says the following: maybe the key to why it says Ben Elazar ben Aaron, it doesn't mean Pinchas was the son of Elazar and Elazar was the son of Aaron, which is the way we translate it. Rather, it means Pinchas had two fathers. Pinchas was the biological son of Elazar, and he was the spiritual son of Aaron. Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron. He has two fathers. Physically, he's Elazar's son and Aaron's grandson. Spiritually, he's directly from Aaron. What is the significance of this? So let's go back a little bit. Alexander Pope once remarked about hypocrisy. People say hypocrisy is so bad, I don't want to be a hypocrite. He says hypocrisy has something positive about it. It's the tribute that vice pays to virtue. It's a famous aphorism. Because if I am compelled to be a hypocrite, I don't want to do certain things publicly that are not considered proper, at least I'm acknowledging that there's a certain standard I ought to be living according to, even if I'm not. So it's a tribute. It's a silent tribute that vice is paying to a certain standard of virtue. So we often say in Torah and mitzvahs, hypocrisy, again, one tries not to live that way, but l'maisa, if you do the right thing even for the wrong reasons, it counts for something. That's called shalol lishma. What does the Gemara say? One should learn Torah, one should do mitzvahs, even if you're doing it for ulterior motives, even if you're doing it for glory, even if you're doing it for ego gratification. It's not the highest madrega, of course, but what do Chazal say? Mitoch shalol lishma. You do the right thing for the wrong reasons. You start off not for the sake of God, but eventually the mitzvot have a momentum, they have a power, they have a light, they have a hashpa'ah, and that will bring you to a good place. So when people say, I don't want to keep Shabbos because I don't really feel I'm up there yet and it would be a hypocrisy for me, we say it's okay to be a hypocrite. In fact, the Moabite women themselves exemplify this in an amazing way. The Torah says further on that we are not allowed to marry Moabite people even if they convert to Judaism, because they were so selfish they did not give us food and water when we went through their land, and they hired Bilam to curse us. Now, if you remember the story of Rus, you will recall that the halacha is this only applies to male Moabite converts. It does not apply to female Moabite converts, and that's why Ruth was permitted to marry into the Jewish people. And the Gemara explains, why are women different? Because the men should have offered us food and water, so they can be condemned for their stinginess. But the women are not supposed to go out and offer food and water to a foreign army. It's not sniut, it's not modest. And therefore we can't penalize the women for becoming tznuot. Now, here's the issue. Was their motive in not offering food and water anything connected to tzniut? Mm-hmm. Of course not, because when it comes to the fornication of Baal Peor, they're perfectly happy to be engaged in these sins. So, their not bringing out food and water was not a function of modesty at all. It was a function of selfishness and callousness. If that's the case, they ought to be condemned just like the men are condemned. So why does the Torah give the women a free pass if their motive was just as bad as the men? The answer is because even though their motive was bad, but they did the right thing. In other words, if it is morally proper for women not to go out to that invading army, they did the right action for the wrong purpose. And the Torah says, but you did the right action, we're not going to penalize you. Mashen came the men should have gone out, the men did the wrong action, objectively. So in a sense, the halachic status of women Moabites was more lenient precisely because of the hypocrisy in what they did. So, generally speaking, therefore, if somebody asks me, should they keep mitzvot even if they don't have the feeling, even if they don't have the motivation, even if they're not doing it for the sake of God, even if they're doing it not to be embarrassed among other people, is it still worthwhile? The answer is yes. But there's one exception. There's one particular mitzvah where if you're not doing it for the sake of God, don't do it at all. And that is to be a zealot. A zealot is a person who stands up for God's glory and is willing to even risk his own life and take the lives of others if necessary. But if you want to be a zealot, you can't do it because you love to do it. You have to hate to do it. I remember, many of you may know a very well-known rabbi, he's really retired, somewhat retired now, Rabbi Avi Weiss, controversial guy. He was the rabbi in Riverdale, the founder of the Open Orthodox Yeshiva Chovevei Torah. Again, that's a whole talk for another time. But Avi Weiss was really one of the first real activist rabbis. You know, when there was agitation to get the Jews out of the former Soviet Union, he would demonstrate in front of the Soviet embassy. He would get arrested. He would get beaten. He would get dragged away. He was a big proponent of civil rights, social activism. His heart is really a very, very warm heart. He cares a lot about people and about needy people, primarily Jewish causes and the like. And he always got his picture in the newspaper, New York Times. They always took pictures of dragging him away. So he once made a statement, which I thought was a very good statement. I can't vouch whether it actually is true in his case. I don't know. I don't want to opine. But he said, if you really want to be a true activist, you have to hate what you're doing. You cannot love what you're doing. Because if you love what you're doing, you're too connected to the publicity, to the glamour, to having your picture in the newspaper, to being on the 6 o'clock news. And then you're no longer focused on the work that has to be done, that's often very undramatic. You have to be a person who basically says, I would rather be in the Beis HaMedrash studying Torah, but I'm doing what I have to do because it needs to be done. And it is a sacrifice for me to do it, but I'm doing it for the glory of God and for my love for the Jewish people. That is a kosher activist. It's not a means to achieve a certain goal, but the activism becomes a goal. I like to be in the papers. At that point, it becomes illegitimate. At that point, it becomes strafe. At that point, it becomes ego gratification and self-aggrandizement. So, if you want to be an activist, you want to be a zealot. Now, Pinchas, of course, is the extreme of zealousness. That involves killing somebody. But we could extrapolate in all sorts of other ways. You want to be a demonstrator on behalf of Shabbos, or you want to demonstrate for some religious cause, whatever that cause might be. If you're doing so to get attention, if you're doing so to put down other people, if you're doing so for the publicity, then don't do it. You have to do it for the sake of God and because of love for the Jewish people. And that is what the Torah is saying when Pinchas had two fathers. Pinchas was genealogically, biologically, the son of Elazar, but spiritually, Aaron was his father. Now, who is Aaron? Aaron is the prototype, Pirkei Avos says, of the Ohev Shalom and the Rodef Shalom, the lover of peace, the pursuer of peace. Ohev es habrios, one who loved, doesn't mean love people. Brios means he loved all of God's creatures. That includes everybody. That includes animals. You know, umakarvan l'Torah, and through his love, he brought people to Torah. Aaron was a person of love, of reconciliation, of peace. By the Torah describing Pinchas as Ben Aaron, which the Kesef Sofer says does not mean the grandson of Aaron, but the spiritual son of Aaron, the Torah is made that Pinchas by nature and inclination was not an activist. He was not a violent person. He was not a person who rejoiced in uncovering no pun intended, the soft underbelly of wrongdoers. He acted not because it was his nature to act. He acted in spite of his nature, for the love of Am Yisrael, and that God should show mercy on the Jewish people that are dying. So that is what the Torah is telling us. Hypocrisy has no place when it comes to being a zealot. A zealot must be acting out of love of God and love of Israel, and not to condemn and not to put people down. Now they say, in the name of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, the great Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, a very wonderful mashal. How do you tell if a person is a true kanoi, or what is the definition of a true zealot and an illegitimate zealot? Let's imagine that a woman, a housewife, has a house that's infected with mice, and she wants to get a cat to kill the mice. So in most places in the world you'd have to buy a cat. Here, just go into the street and pull in a cat. Now the housewife and the cat have a common agenda, that if there are mice, you want the cat to get the mice. But there's a big difference between their attitudes. The housewife would be much happier if there were no mice at all. The cat would be sorely disappointed. Rav Chaim says, a true kanoi looks at the world and sees problems, sees immorality, sees the desecration of God's name, sees the mitzvahs not being kept, sees so many Jews who are far from the Torah. And in his heart or her heart, there is pain, there is suffering. Suffering for God, suffering for the Jewish people, suffering and care for the Jews who are not keeping the commandments, that you want to help bring them back. And if you conclude reluctantly that sometimes you have to demonstrate, sometimes you have to do something, you do so with reluctance. You do so as a last resort. That's the housewife who never has to kill the mice sometimes. If they're infecting, if they're infesting, if they're infecting, if they're whatever it is, they're spreading disease. But if you're a kanoi who enjoys exposing the shortcomings of others, who's looking for the heretic of the month, who will go through somebody's 600-page book to identify the footnote on page 555 that says something that's a little against the standard yeshivish conventional wisdom, and you have, aha, I knew he was an apikoros. You're no longer a person who is concerned for the glory of God. You're getting a perverse joy in exposing the shortcomings of others. You want to be the cat that pounces on the mouse. That is not kanos anymore. That is not kanos. You know, I sometimes have, maybe it's an overreaction on my part, but you know, obviously we live in a society where many, many people take on the mantle of being zealots, blocking traffic, blocking trains, whatever it would be. And they have a cause. And again, I'm not going to address the merits, but you know, the issue of yeshiva students, the draft, you know, these are you know, issues that have to be discussed and have to be ironed out. But I sometimes see people at these demonstrations, and whether it's even for Shabbos, whatever it might be protesting a gay march, it might be protesting women at the wall, it might be protesting the drafting of yeshiva students, whatever the cause is. And it has like a semi-festive air. They're having a good time, laughing, joking, when they're not being beaten by the police. But you know, it's fun, especially if you have younger kids. Sometimes you have these like 6th graders, pre-bar mitzvah kids. They're just having a real good time throwing stones or whatever it would be. Now, even if we assume, and I actually deny that there is any legitimacy, that there might be legitimate times in which you have to protest in a very strong and powerful way, but you do so with sadness. You don't do so with happiness. What, you're happy that there are Jews that are Machalel Shabbos that you can throw stones at? You're happy that there are people who are inferior to you in your spirituality, so you can look down upon them? That's not kanos. That's the cat looking for the mice. So, the Kesav Sofer's point is a very meaningful point, that Pinchas was a Ben Aaron, and he did what he did against his nature. As Avi Weiss said, he did it because he hated to do it, not because he loved to do it. If you love doing it, then you're not the person for the job. Get somebody else. You get somebody who hates to do it, and as a result acts out of love and concern, and not out of the schadenfreude, the joy of exposing the failings of another. Now, the reason why I think there's a certain element of autobiography here is the Chassam Sofer himself, Rav Moshe Sofer, was the leading militant Orthodox rabbi of the 18th and 19th century to combat the Reform movement in a very, very powerful way. The Reform movement was developing in Germany and in Hungary, and the Chassam Sofer was really, really very, very militant to ensure that the Reform modes of worship would not be accepted among Jews, and their rabbis would not be given legitimacy. And he was seen by those of a more liberal bent, even within Orthodoxy, as somewhat of a fanatic. In fact, interestingly enough, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter said, almost 100 years later, that he disagreed with the Chassam Sofer's approach of delegitimating Reform entirely. He thought that if the Orthodox would have more communication with the Reform, perhaps there could have been a beneficial influence. But the Chassam Sofer basically was, we are cutting ourselves off from them, we will have nothing to do with them. Again, I'm not going to debate the Chassam Sofer's approach versus Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's approach, but I think the Kesav Sofer is telling us, at least indirectly, don't think my father was a hater. Don't think my father got joy in cutting people off. Don't think he was rejoicing in exposing other people's shortcomings. He acted out of love. He acted out of concern. And he cried for those Jews who were not connected to the Torah in various ways. So I've always felt there was a strong autobiographical current in the Kesav Sofer's discussion of Pinchas, that perhaps he had a mental image in his own mind of his great father, who was no longer alive when the Kesav Sofer wrote this, the Chassam Sofer. So that's one thing to think of. And let me share with you a thought of the great Rav Kook. Shemona Esrei, the prayer that we recite 3 times a day, is called Shemona Esrei, the 18 blessings. And that, of course, is a misnomer, because a weekday Amidah has 19 blessings, not 18 blessings. But the Gemara explains, originally there were 18 blessings from the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. But after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, when the Sanhedrin was in a place called Yavneh, Rabban Gamliel, the head of the Sanhedrin, felt we needed an extra blessing against the heretics, the missionaries, the informers. There's still a lot of discussion exactly who is this directed against. And Rabban Gamliel said, who can write a bracha against the missionaries? Remember, this is during the years of early Christianity, which was operating within Judaism at the time. So they were a very dangerous force, even much more so than today. We have Messianic Jews today, but there, many of the Christians were actually going to the synagogues and the like. Who will write a bracha against the minim, against the sectarians? And they looked and they looked and they finally identified a rabbi who was known as Shmuel HaKatan, Shmuel the Humble. And he is the author of V'lamalshinim Al Tihi Tikva, which was it is not the 19th in the order, but it was the 19th, the last bracha that was added to Shemona Esrei. This is the Gemara in Brachos that explains that originally it was 18, and Shmuel HaKatan in Yavneh, after the destruction of the temple, added the 19th blessing. So Rav Kook, in his commentary in the Siddur, asks a very simple question. What is the big deal? Rabban Gamliel seems to be saying, gee, we need to find an author for this blessing. What is so difficult to compose? The same way the other blessings were composed, compose this one. What is so unique about this blessing that there's difficulty in finding an author, and what qualified Shmuel HaKatan to be that author. So Rav Kook says a wonderful thought. Rabbi Kook says, V'lamalshinim al tehi tikva is unique in the whole Amidah. Because the whole Amidah, we're always asking God for blessings. Give us parnasa, give us refuah, give us geula, give us the good things that we need. We don't ask for God to punish other people. We don't ask for God to destroy other people. We ask Hashem to give us bracha in life, both individually and collectively, for Am Yisrael and even the world. The only bracha in the Amidah that openly calls for punishment and retribution is this bracha against the informers and the missionaries and the apostates. So here is Rabbi Gamliel's dilemma, so to speak. Rabbi Gamliel's dilemma is, when you ask God to punish, you can't be motivated out of anger and hate. Because even if your anger and hate is directed towards a legitimate target, God does not respond to those emotions. Your motive has to be that if these are enemies that are destroying our nation, I ask God out of compassion for Am Yisrael to get rid of the enemies. You have to be motivated out of love for Am Yisrael and love of God, not out of hatred and anger. Again, Rav Kook's position, it was a little controversial, that even hatred and anger directed against the wicked is not the proper stance in prayer to God. And even when you pray that God should destroy the wicked, it has to be in the context to protect the Jewish people from a cancer that could destroy it. So ultimately your motive has to be rooted in love and not in hate. So when Rabbi Gamliel says, who can write this bracha? Rabbi Gamliel means we live in difficult times. The Romans are persecuting us. There are Christians that are deceiving us. There are missionaries. There are Jews that are informers to the enemy. Who could possibly write a bracha against them and not have an agenda of hate and anger? It's like a prayer against the Nazis. Who could write a prayer against the Nazis in World War II and not incorporate in that prayer some feeling of animus? So Rabbi Gamliel had a dilemma. I don't have a suitable author. But the author that he chose was Shmuel HaKatan. Now, who is Shmuel HaKatan? Shmuel HaKatan, we actually know very little about. The one thing we do know is that he was extremely great. In fact, once he was sitting with the Sanhedrin, and a voice from heaven came out and said, there is one person in this room who is as deserving of the divine presence resting on him as Moshe Rabbeinu. And the whole room looked at Shmuel HaKatan because they knew that he was the one that the Bas Kol was talking about. So we know he was an exceptional person compared to Moshe, but he literally has no teachings that are recorded in the Talmud except for one in Pirkei Avos. And the teaching in Pirkei Avos isn't even his own words. It's a pasuk in Proverbs that he used to quote. Shmuel HaKatan Haya Omer. And again, this is a pasuk. This is not his own words. But apparently, it was like his mission statement, his motto. He quoted it all the time. And that is the famous verse, B'nafol oyevecha al tismach. When your enemy is destroyed, do not rejoice. Rav Kook says, that is why Rabbi Gamliel chose Shmuel HaKatan to write the bracha V'lamalshinim al tehi tikva. Because Shmuel HaKatan internalized the idea that I don't rejoice in the downfall of the other. I rejoice in the peace that we have. I rejoice in the Yeshua that Am Yisrael has. And if that means I had to get rid of things, I got rid of them. The destruction. Many of you remember the famous or infamous, many people do consider it infamous, but there's a kernel of truth in it, Golda Meir's statement that she can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. That's the part that people very much hate, rightfully so, but we cannot forgive the Arabs for making us kill their children. So I would say this, let's cut off the first half of the sentence. That's hurtful and maybe offensive. But the second half does reflect something. We are not pacifists. We are absolutely not pacifists. We do not believe in turning the other cheek. It's not just modern Israel. This is halachic Judaism. Does not believe in turning the other cheek. Haba lahargecha, somebody who's trying to kill you, you kill them first. And that's what we do. That's the halacha. Absolutely. But we don't do so with joy. We do it because we have to do it. We do it when we have to do it. But there is no joy. I got the person. You may have seen pictures years ago of terrorists who had murdered a Jewish family, and they dipped their hands in blood. There was in the New York Times. They dipped their hands in the blood of the people they murdered. And they were dancing around like in a frenzy. And the photo captured the drops of blood. You could see the drops of blood coming off their hand. It's inconceivable. Unless a Jewish person was seriously mentally ill, it would be inconceivable that a Jewish soldier, or any Jew, would do that. Even if he had to kill a terrorist. I don't want to reopen old wounds. Even Baruch Goldstein, who was drawn to kill many people in a way that was not proper. But Baruch Goldstein was a person who had ministered to Arabs and had taken care of them. And he did not have a sense of joy. He, again, rightly or wrongly, let's assume it was not correct, but he acted out of a sense of duty, not out of a sense of some pleasure that he's doing some great joyous act in destroying others. Baruch Goldstein, had he survived, would certainly not have been dancing in the blood of the victims of his act. So, Kanos, in Pinchas's case, was extreme, but I think it has lessons for how we approach any process of denigrating other people. That, number one, it's a last resort, and number two, our motives have to be love. It cannot be anger, it cannot be a desire to expose people's shortcomings, and that explains the paradox of why Pinchas, who committed the act of violence, was given the bracha of peace. Because Pinchas's motives were ultimately peace and reconciliation. And God is testifying that was his motive. As a Ben Aaron, Ohev Shalom, V'rodev Shalom. Otherwise, peace would not have been the appropriate bracha. But I do want to point out the following interesting idea. I don't know if any of you ever heard of Sisela Bach. The only reason I happen to know her name is that her husband was the longtime president of Harvard University. Right. So Sisela is a philosopher, and she writes in a few areas, but one of her areas was exploring truth and lying. She wrote a very well-regarded book on lying. Is it ever morally justified to lie? And she makes a point, and she's not the first one to make it. In fact, Chazal make the point, but part of her long-term thesis is that even when an action is morally justifiable, even when it is the proper thing to do, that does not immunize you from a taint in the soul. In other words, her example was that there are times in which it's necessary to lie, but the lying itself is a taint, and it's a childish belief to think that because I made the right decision, there are going to be no negative consequences. If I jump into a burning building and rescue a baby, I did a noble, wonderful, good thing. But there's a quite strong possibility that I'm still going to suffer second or third degree burns. And I can't make the argument, but I did such a wonderful thing. Once in a while, God does miracles. Or the fellow, very tragic, the rabbi who was carried out to sea and drowned very tragically. He saved a child's life. And yet, he was caught in the undertow, and he died. So, Dr. Bach makes the argument that when you lie, there is always a pagam, there is always kind of a defect in you. That even when you made the morally correct decision, you are tainted. Now in truth, this is a statement that we find in many, many Sifrei Musar, that also, although there are many heterim to lie for peace and to avoid conflict and the like, but one should try to minimize that because there is a certain detriment and a certain baggage. We see, for example, King David is another example, not for lying. David HaMelech was not permitted to build the Beis HaMikdash because he was a man of war, a man of violence. Now the problem is, every war that David HaMelech fought was a mitzvah war. God commanded him. He was carrying out the directives of Hashem. So why should that be against him? Nevertheless, you engage in violence, it taints you. And we actually see a similar process with Pinchas. The Gemara tells us that Pinchas lived a very long time, and eventually he morphed and he became Eliyahu Hanavi. Now whether that means, you can always argue what that means, whether that means he literally lived hundreds and hundreds of years, became Eliyahu Hanavi, who in fact never died as well, or whether it means there's a commonality of their neshamos, not that they are, in other words, when Chazal say A is B, that doesn't always mean physically they were the same person. Now Eliyahu Hanavi is a very interesting prophet. Eliyahu Hanavi was also a zealot. In fact, after the famous miracle at Mount Carmel, when he called upon a fire from heaven to consume his offering, and all of the prophets of the Baal cried out and nothing happened, and the Jewish people finally realized the futility of idolatry, and they bowed down and they declared, Hashem hu Elokim, God is the true God, wonderful, mass tshuva. But that tshuva lasted exactly one day. The next day, Achav told Eliyahu, don't think you're out of the woods. I'm going to kill you. And Eliyahu at this point was broken because he had given it his best shot. He had done a supernatural miracle. And its effect was so ephemeral, so short-lived. So he goes into the desert. And he basically says to God, why don't you just forget about these people? They're fickle. They're not committed. They simply move with the latest fad. Get rid of them. Well, what then happened is one of the most beautiful and dramatic scenes. There was a storm and an earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake, and there was a fire, and God was not in the fire. And then there was a quiet, small voice. And Hashem spoke to Eliyahu out of the quiet voice. And essentially, what Hashem told Eliyahu is, you are fired. Go anoint your successor. And the Meforshim basically say that because Eliyahu no longer saw the Jewish people as good and redeemable, he could no longer be their leader. When a leader loses faith in the people he is supposed to lead, he's going to be replaced. And God is telling Eliyahu Hanavi, you don't reach people by fire, by thunder, by lightning, by earthquakes. You reach people by the quiet voice of reason and persuasion. And if you have lost faith in your nation, I'm going to get somebody else to do the job. In fact, the Gemara even says, or the Medrash even says, that Eliyahu Hanavi, who we believe is still alive, and goes on various missions, comes to every bris, every circumcision, and every Pesach Seder. Now this is actually a punishment. Chazal say, because he declares to Hashem, they don't keep your covenants. He meant it in a more general sense. So Hashem says, oh, they don't keep my covenant? Is that what you think? You're going to go to every single bris, and see how most Jews, even Jews who are very far from the Torah, they keep Bris Milah and Pesach Seder. So it's actually Eliyahu's punishment to have to see that the Jewish people are faithful. Although I hope he gets joy out of that experience as well. So here is the suggestion I want to share with you. There are many costs, just as Professor Bach wrote. Even when kanaos is justifiable, and even when it's undertaken for the sake of heaven, it leaves a trace in the soul. And there are, just as by David HaMelech, the violence, by lying leaves that trace. And the trace that kanaos leaves is a sense of negativity and cynicism, in which you look at the world and you're attuned to see the bad in people. You become a professional observer of flaws. And that can carry over, in which you see flaws even in good people, and in leaders, and in rabbis, and Talmidei Chachamim. Mark Twain was a captain of a steamboat on the Mississippi River. That's why his name was Samuel Clemens. Mark Twain was one of the things they would announce as they were going through the river. And Mark Twain has, really, what a beautiful writer. I'm very connected to Mark Twain because he spent his adult years in Hartford, Connecticut, where I'm from. So although he's a Southerner, but his adult life was in the Northeast, New England. And Mark Twain writes about a person looks at the Mississippi River, and you see this beautiful body of water with the sunlight. But he says, once you're a pilot on the river, he says, you never appreciate its beauty again. Because as you're navigating the river, you're aware that that beautiful shadow may show a rock or, some, not an iceberg, but some type of impediment or a branch, and everything is a danger. He even gave the example, it's a little unsneous, but I'll say it, he gave the example of a ballet dancer. You see a dancer, and a ballerina, a ballet dancer, and on one level you see grace, you see movement, fluidity. But let's imagine you're an orthopedic surgeon. So you're watching the stretch and you think, oh, that ligament is stretching, I can see it twist, I can see the muscle fibers tear. So Mark Twain says, when you're trained and expected to notice all of the negativities, which a doctor has to know, a doctor has to see all of the damage that's going on, that can sometimes blind us to the beauties. We don't see the beauties of the dancer. We don't see the beauties of the river. That is one of the moral costs of being a kanoi, in which you're always negative. And that translated into Eliyahu's negativity. That ultimately meant he could no longer be the leader of Klal Yisrael. So there is a certain midah of obliviousness that is helpful. Now, obviously a person has to pay attention to what needs to be corrected in life. But sometimes not so close, not so exact. Understand that most people, most of the time, are trying to be good, are trying to do the right thing. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes we fail, whoever the we and the they are. But to look at things too closely, you look closely, you'll always find something wrong. Whether it's in a marriage, whether it's with respect to your children, your students, your co-workers. There's always negative things that I could find. But the problem is, when you cultivate the negative way of looking at the world, even when it is justifiable, there's a certain taint to the neshama that can really, really inhibit you much, much later in the other endeavors that you do. And therefore, there is a beesline, there is a connection between Pinchas and Eliyahu. Eliyahu, of course, is extremely great. He's going to announce the coming of the Mashiach. But we can't deny that this particular story, he was removed from his office because he could no longer see the good in Am Yisrael. And therefore, he could not be a leader with a negative perspective. And the final remez I want to share with you is that when Hashem promises Pinchas the covenant of peace, Hineni no sein lo esbrisi shalom. If you look in a Sefer Torah, you will see that the vav in shalom is katua, meaning it's cut. It's like split into two. Katua, with a kuf. And maybe there's a remez there, that the peace that you get through violence, even if God blesses you with peace, is going to be an incomplete peace. It's not going to be shalom. Say again? No, because the vav is katua, meaning. No, I didn't say in his life. I just said that the lesson of the katua is that even with the blessing of shalom, it will not be a complete peace if it came through milchama, came through hatred, and the like. So these are things to think about. We're entering the 3 weeks. Sunday is the fast of Shivas or B'Tammuz. It inaugurates the 3-week period where we think a lot about not having the Beis Hamikdash. And all of us know the Gemara is teaching that the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed by the Romans, and the spiritual sin that Am Yisrael had was the sinat chinam, hatred and polarization. And the Gemara itself says the first Beis Hamikdash that was destroyed because of Avodah Zarah, Gilei Araya, Shvichus Damim, the worst of Eros. The whole Galut was only 70 years. And then we had the second temple. The second Mikdash, which was Sinas Chinam, we are still in Galus to this very day, even though we have the privilege personally of being in Eretz Yisrael, but technically we're in Galus. Until we have the Beis Hamikdash, until we have Mashiach, you're in Galus everywhere. Right? One has to know you're in Galus even here. That's why we fast on Tisha B'Av still. In 1967, some people were proposing to abolish the fast of the 9th of Av, but they were just wrong. We don't have the Beis Hamikdash, we don't have Mashiach, we don't have peace in the world. We live under the threat of terrorism and nuclear war all the time. Right? So the Geula is not yet here, although we hope it is approaching. So what do we do to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash? We don't rebuild the Beis Hamikdash by bombing the Temple Mount. We have to wait for Mashiach to do that. But we build the Beis Hamikdash by trying to eradicate within our own lives those factors that caused the destruction of the temple. And if the factor that caused the Churban HaMikdash was Sinas Chinam, our Ikar Avoda to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash has to be to grow in our Avas Yisrael, our love and our concern, to abolish the bridges, abolish the barriers between different groups of Jews, to try to build bridges, and to see the value and contribution of all of the different segments of society to the country that we have, to the world that we have. So I've said, now again, obviously everyone knows that presently there is a major political debate about military service and yeshiva students and charedim and the like, and I'm not here at all to talk about the merits of that debate. There are arguments on different sides, and this is something that needs to be discussed. It is a major issue. On one side there is equality of burden, Shivay HaNetel. On the other side there is the importance of Torah study, and how do you balance all of those different factors. An important discussion. But one thing that is lacking in the discussion is an attitudinal aspect of each side appreciating the importance of what the other side is doing. If the Haredi world, or the religious world, whatever you want to call it, maybe it's the Haredi world I'll say, because the religious world includes people who are in Hester and the like, but if the Haredi world were to appreciate what the army does for Am Yisrael and for our country, instead of denigrating the institution, if there would be a sense of Hakarat HaTov, then I think people on the other side of the debate would see what Torah learning does for the Medina and the like. This is a pasuk in Mishlei. I probably have quoted this pasuk 100 times already, but I'll say it 101 times. Shlomo HaMelech writes, Kamayim apanim el panim came leif adam liadam. Water reflects the face that you show it, and the human heart reflects what you show it. I look at a pool of water. If I smile at that pool, I see a smiling face. If I frown at that pool, I see a frowning face. The heart of a human being reflects that which it is shown. I show a person respect, appreciation, love, and care. They will feel towards me appreciation, respect, love, and care. I show them denigration, delegitimation, demonization. They will look at me the same way. Now, you can always raise the argument, well, who should start? Let the other side start, whoever the other, let them like me and I'll like them. Why do I have to start liking them? Okay, answer. Somebody has to be the grown-up in the room. I mean, this comes up in marriage counseling all the time. Somebody says, the counselor says, show your spouse more affection. So the person says, well, he or she should show me more affection, then I'll show them more affection. Okay, everybody is waiting for the other person to start something. It never gets started. So, those people who keep the Torah and follow the Torah have the responsibility for starting a process. And starting the process is to acknowledge with gratitude the contribution of everyone who has built up the state of Israel. Whether it's army, whether it's police, whether it's fire, whether it's government, whether it's the garbage collectors. They all do everything. We need it. They help us. They contribute to the society we live in. And if there would be hakarat hatov, appreciation, gratitude, even to people who are not shomer mitzvot, and kal v'chomer for those who are also shomer mitzvot, even if it's not in our particular way, then I think we would have much more respect and love with respect to whatever it is that we would be trying to advocate. Kamayim hapanim el panim. Now in the Middle East, the whole style of argumentation is the opposite. Instead of kind of acknowledging the legitimacy of the other side, anyone that doesn't espouse my position is an idiot at best, and is a Russia, a devil, and Amalek at worst. Well, that's why nothing ever gets resolved, really, because Kamayim al panim al panim. It's an unending spiral of delegitimating the person that disagrees with you. And I think maybe I'm being a naive American here. I don't know, but I'm basing it on Shlomo HaMelech in Mishlei. Right, he lived here too. That Shlomo HaMelech says that the secret to resolving conflict is Kamayim hapanim al panim, to see the other side. And indeed, that is why etymologically, shalom, peace, and shalem, wholeness, are connected. Because when you see the totality of the story, you see the other sides to the argument, you will come to shalom. Because you can acknowledge the different truths that exist in multiple narratives. And when people feel that their piece of truth is being listened to, then they will be more open to hear your piece of truth. Again, I'm referring right now to Jew versus Jew. I'm not referring to Jew versus Arab or whatever. That may be a different type of discussion. I mean, it may be okay, but I don't want to get into that because of the controversy. But certainly with Jew versus Jew, I think it's very, very definitely going to be the case. So as we enter the 3 weeks, may all of us try to resolve to be these types of people, and in that way we can make our own contribution towards the Binyan Beis HaMikdash. May it be b'mheira v'yameinu.
Yiboneh Archives,